Hello, everyone. Welcome to church worship. It's been a minute since I've seen you and I miss you. So I'm recording this lecture on chapter 3 in Melva Costin's book. Sorry for my lateness getting caught up with some things this week. All right, so this week we're going to talk about chapter 3 in Dr. Melva Costin's book. Just a few announcements. Let me share my screen. I hope that you all are doing well. Just a few announcements for class. We are almost there. So we're in week 8. Make sure that you're checking out week 8. You do have the ring shout discussion post that will be due on the 25th of July at the end of the evening, 11:59. This week, you should have been reading in chapter 3 of Dr. Melva Costin's book, Worship in Invisible Institutions. You can stop at the caption that says prayer or praying. Also, I want you to go ahead and get caught up on your worship research paper. This worship research paper will compare and contrast worship in terms of slave practices of weddings. And you can see chapter 5 in Dr. Costin's book, and also the history of Christian marriage, chapter 5 in Susan White's book. In your paper, I want you to compare and contrast those two practices. So we know that marriage is a worship practice. Give a background to Christian marriage. We've been talking about that in our course. And you can also include what it looked like in biblical times. In Old Testament, we talked about Jewish as well as worship that, marriages that were done in early times. All right. And then you can share how it compared with how slaves were introduced to marriage. This paper should explore that area in at least 3 pages, double space, and make sure that you cite all of your work that is not your own in MLA citations. Also, if you get stuck, you're like, how do I do that? I'm not sure. Go to syllabus and resources right up here, and where it says MLA citation help, there is a helpful link that will help you with in-text citation, your bibliography, as well as making sure that you capture the person's information correctly and give them credit. All right, everybody, let's go to our lesson, chapter 3, in Dr. Costin's book, Worship in the Invisible Institution. What is this invisible institution? So we're going to talk about, we've been talking in this course about Christian worship, and now we're in the second half of our semester, focusing more so on slave worship and African worship, and how that had an influence on what we see today. Our enslaved ancestors did not just worship with their slave masters, but they also worshiped among themselves in their own secret places. These secret places were called brush arbors, secret places located maybe by water, in the woods, or maybe just in a shack. Okay. These worship spaces were divine. They were sacred. They were hollowed out just for their own worship style. And they could worship the way that they wanted to worship. So, of course, imagine they're going to worship with their slave master. And not that it was wrong, but that was just a different way that the, white slave master may have worshiped. And our African ancestors were not used to that from the countries that they came from in Africa. In these invisible institutions, And when we say invisible, not like you couldn't see them, but they were hidden from the slave master. In these divine spaces that they carved out for themselves, there was their own preaching, their teaching. There was lots of singing and shouting. There was times of listening to the Spirit of God. And in these spaces, in these sacred spaces that they had, they were able to form their own relationship with the Lord. Okay. And so when we say invisible institutions, not like it was magic or something and they were waving a magic wand and they would disappear. We're not saying that, but these were institutions of worship that were instituted by our ancestors that were kept out of the eye of their white slave masters. So they did these things in secret. So what happened in these secret gatherings? In these secret gatherings, there was a lot of community. They could express their own beliefs. You know, they could say it, they could do it the way they wanted to. These newly arrived African ancestors were allowed to practice Christianity and also blend their traditional African religions into it as well. So a lot of the dancing, the movements, the singing that you still see in the Black church today, that's blended with traditional African religion. And that was when the slaves went to church with their slave masters, the dancing and the moving around and those type of movements and things like that were not expressed. Manners of expression. Let's talk about expression. They could express themselves in their own African communication. They Africans are help me find the right word, expressive. So clapping the hands, voicing out, speaking out to the preacher or in song. And salvation gave the slaves hope. Okay, it was when they came together, they spoke of brighter days. They weren't sure how those brighter days were going to come, whether they were going to see it on earth or in heaven, but that salvation was always encouraged to them. All right, sacred spaces. In these sacred spaces, in those invisible institutions, there were elements that were located. One of the things that helped them stay in secret was water or water pots. Okay, so let's think about water. So what our ancestors did, isn't this awesome? They would take quilts or heavy blankets and saturate them in water. And you ever seen a quilt, but imagine soaking it in water. It absorbs sound. What was that point? So nobody would hear them. They would also use a large black iron wash pot and they would fill it with water. And many of them, as they would sing or preach or pray, they would come around that water pot and speak or sing or whatever, so that the water would drown out their sound. Shout or something could get really loud, but when they gathered around those pots of water, it drowned out their sound so that the slave master would not hear them. There's another thing that the water pot may also mean to those enslaved ancestors. And from the Yoruba tradition, African tradition, the water pot may also be a symbol of a Yoruba god named Ishu Elegba. Okay, so I want you to understand that as our ancestors were formulating worship, they were blending so many different traditions into it. Slave worship. So sometimes slaves from different plantations could have a worship service, and that was called a camp meeting. And so the slave master, I guess, was kind enough, to allow different plantation slaves to come together and have their own worship service. And this provided, imagine, fellowship among other people that look like them. Maybe, just maybe, these were other family members that were separated, or other friends that they were separated from. Some slaves also held their own meeting after the camp meetings. So they had maybe have had additional meetings, additional encouragement after those camp meetings were over. Slave worship, remember, encompassed African worship. There was music, movement. Those were foundational. Songs were foundational to slave worship. Testimonies, confessions, praying, preaching of the word. It is said in slave worship that worship was called, or it was announced that they would call out to people, and not to people, but call out to the other slaves and let them know that, hey, it's time to worship. It's time for us to come together. And hence, even in my own church, and maybe some of the churches that you visited and the ones that you attend, have in the beginning of the service called a call to worship. Our slave ancestors sung spirituals. Those spirituals had deep meaning in them, lots of metaphors that only they knew what they were singing, like steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. And so in those words that they were singing, they were bringing encouragement to themselves, but also it could also be code to say, you know what, we're going to get on up out of here this evening. So the spirituals had a lot of coded message in it. Slave worship could be just with the slaves singing and encouraging each other, or it could have been with a preacher. So remember now, everybody was not, educated and could read the Bible, but so they still made ways to worship. Even in their slave worship, we find some things that you still see in churches today. They would greet each other. They would shake hands. There's a slave recording, a testimony from years and years and years ago, where this freed slave would talk about worship, and he said that they were, in the beginning of the service, that they would ask each other how they were feeling. How are you doing? Kind of checking in with each other. Isn't that awesome? Let's talk about prayer in worship. And so prayer was present in a slave worship service as well. And so remember, it may not be as intricate as we see worship today, but it was meaningful to them. And prayer time was also a continuation of what they were already doing in Africa. In African religions, they were praying too. So they didn't just start praying when they got to Americas. They were already praying to God. Prayer for them was a way to stay in communication with God, as it is still today. In Christian worship, in other denominations, but also here we're focusing on the slave worship. But prayer time was not a passive time. It wasn't a time where they just sat there and just listened to the prayer and fell asleep. But this was a time for them to become involved. And hence, if you listen to a Black church, when the minister or pastor or whoever, deacon, is praying, you will many times hear verbal responses. People joining in and saying amen. That is in our DNA. That is from Africa. That is African worship. Prayer included invocations, adoring or adoration of God, praise, thanksgiving, interceding on other people's behalf, and a petition of what they wanted the Creator God to do. It's also interesting, so interesting, if you look at this point 5, that the slaves also included a closing in their prayers that let people know that their prayers were reliant upon God. They would say, you know, God's will be done, or the Lord's will be done, something like that, because they were petitioning this prayer, but they were dependent on God to answer the prayer. So now I want you to think, as we're coming towards the end of this session, or coming towards the end of this class, we started talking about different elements, very wide elements about church worship, music. We talked about instruments, and we talked about things that are done. We talked about burials, and we talked about marriages. And here we're taking a spin and looking at how things have still transpired in the Black church from our African ancestors. So I say all that to say that if our awesome ancestors had not come and had not been through the things that they've been through, right, our church would look real different. But the key thing that I want you to take from this course is our worship is rooted in African religion. Enslaved African ancestors had a formalized religion already. And when they arrived here in America, they took what they had that was deep down in their soul and used the tools that were here in America and blended those things together. And of course, over time, things have evolved and changed, but for the most part, it is still there. Aren't we glad about it? All right, everybody, don't want to hold you too long. Please make sure that if you have any questions, let me know, and continue to work on your research paper. That will be due on August 3rd. Take care. Have a blessed day.